Welcome to City Scripts. I'm Asha, and we run City Scripts monthly now, and it's a series of interactions around the urban, and we do it in various forms, and all of this will culminate in our annual festival, which is scheduled for May. Today, we'll be talking about public spaces, and it's inspired by our current library exhibition, which is curated by Subair from IHS, and you can see the book display behind you, and the rest of the exhibition can be looked at in the library, so please feel free to go upstairs afterwards. It's open to everyone. So the idea for this panel was to basically look at how people interact with public spaces, how it sort of affects memory, how you feel about a city, and what are the projects in making public spaces open to people, because obviously we can call them public spaces, but they may not really be open to the public in that way. So before we start, I'll just quickly introduce our panelists and hand it over to them. We have Swati, who's joining us online from Delhi. Thank you so much for being here. Swati is an architect based in Delhi whose work engages with housing rights and social justice. By combining grassroots activism with policy advocacy, she's been advocating for the right to the city and against displacement of self-built neighborhoods. Awarded the Moira Jamil Prize for Emerging Architecture in 2022, she's the founder of the interdisciplinary practice Social Design Collaborative. Currently, she's also guiding public projects as an expert at the CITIIS project coordinated by NIUA and supported by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, AFD, and the European Union. She regularly writes on urban issues, from participatory planning to public spaces, including for the Indian Express, Kroll, and City Lab. Thank you for being here. We also have Yash Bhandari with us, who's formally trained in sculpture at Chitrikala Parishad, and his core understanding of the practice became the base to expand into public space practice with Gichagalu, an art in transit project under Shishti Manipal Institute, to facilitate art and design practices. Yash enjoys challenging thought and constantly working with new networks and mediums to unlearn biases and work around similar thematics using art practice for introspection, all with a little room for irony and self-critique. His practice switches between community participation, urban interventions, performance to spatial design, multimedia installation, graphic art, curation, and sculpture with found materials as he attempts to work through their limitations and his own. Thank you so much for being here, and a very intimidating set of skills. We're also joined by Namrata Singh, who's an architect and an entrepreneur who co-founded Cohort X, a design firm in Bengaluru. The firm aims to transform the built environment through collaboration, active management, and public negotiation. Namrata leads the design teams for urban and public architecture projects and collaborates with various experts. Cohort X has worked on projects like Aralikate, K100, City Waters, and Katakeri, am I saying? Katakeri, sorry. Partnering with government agencies and stakeholders. Namrata enjoys the natural environment, birding, travel, and scuba diving. Thank you again, Thomas, for joining us. Our moderator for this evening is Kiran Keswani, and we're very glad she agreed to do this with us. She's the co-founder of Everyday City Lab that focuses on design, research, and teaching on public spaces. Prior to setting up the lab, Kiran practiced as an architect and urban designer for over 20 years. She holds a PhD in urban design from SEPT University, Ahmedabad. She was a co-recipient of the Azim Premji Research Grant for 2018-19 and has been researching Ashwat Kattes as a neighborhood community space since 2015. She has taught urban design studios at SEPT University and open courses at Azim Premji University. Recently, the lab has developed an online portal, Decoding Every Day, that invites citizens to share stories from their neighborhoods towards building an inclusive city. So please do check that out also, probably like after the conversation, not during the conversation. So thank you everyone for joining us. We will be taking questions in the end, so please wait for the mic to be handed over to you before you ask your questions. And may I please request everyone to put their phones on silent as we start. Over to you, Kiran.
Okay, thanks so much, Asha. Thanks for inviting all of us. And we're really looking forward to this conversation. As Asha said that, we would be inviting questions at the end, but just before we started, we have sort of discussed that the end might actually be in the middle. So we are hoping that you'll be ready with your questions, soon after the panelists have shared a little bit of their work. And then we can sort of keep bouncing back to them. So I think that, we are all of us here, really in a position to say something about public spaces, everyone here, because we have, used them. But we would still like to just reiterate what it might mean to us. So I think public spaces for cities become really important because of both physical and mental well-being. And I think we all were sort of very sure about the physical well-being part, but after the pandemic, it has sort of hit us really hard that without these public spaces and without the social interaction that they allow, that, the mental well-being of a city gets impacted in not such a good way if we don't have enough of them, if we don't have public spaces that are accessible, that are safe and reachable. So I think it's all sort of very clear to us that we need them. We also know that in cities, they come in different scales. So we have city-level parks, we have neighborhood-level parks, and in the Indian context, and I think everybody here, our panelists here, have been really working on the ground, and that's why, I think it was good to have them here, because they're going to be talking about how they have engaged with not just the what is considered as the designated public space, but also those that are unplanned, right? So, and I think in the Indian context, we seem to have a lot of those, like we have maidans, we have ashwat kattes, we have at our lab, we sort of keep emphasizing that in the Indian context, street is the predominant public space. And I think all of these, in a way, are inclusive already. But I think that there are times when they tend to get sort of encroached upon by one group more than another. And I think that's the distinction we'd like to make here, that when is that really happening, and how do we prevent that? So how do we make them accessible to all if they are not currently accessible? How do we make them safe? Because those are I think, the key benefits of a public space. So with that, I think we just get started. We would be having each panelist first just share their work, and typically, I think in a panel discussion, it's just a conversation, just people talking, but here the panelists have expressed an interest in also bringing slides, and we thought it would be very nice because it would take us straight into places where they have worked. So yeah, Swati, would you like to start? We can just get started.
Hello everyone, good evening. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me. I feel like a disembodied, digital entity right now, sort of deconstructed. My face is somewhere, my eyes are somewhere, my ears are somewhere, but let's make this work. So public spaces are really the life of our built environment. And for me, the journey started with my training as an architect. So for a few years, I was working in mainstream architecture, but I began to feel disillusioned by the way the profession is practiced, because, well, most people in our country don't have access to the services of an architect, of a designer. And then over time, I started dissociating myself from the field of architecture. So before I really get into what we have been up to, I think it's important to talk a bit about where I'm coming from. Over time, I realized that every time I had to introduce myself, I would introduce myself as, I'm trained as an architect, but I'm not an architect. I do non-architecty things. I'm an unarchitect, if you will. But every time my frame of reference was architecture. So I think in the past years, I have learned to embrace this identity. We're responsible for, I think, a lot of harm in our society, in our built environment. But at the same time, I feel like in working at the margins, or what I feel are the margins or the fringes of the profession, Perhaps I'm also doing sort of my part in expanding these margins, right? Expanding the limits of or the scope of what this profession is, and also sort of trying to rethink the field itself. And I've met a lot of people who feel more comfortable in these sort of marginal spaces, if you will, or let's call them intersectional spaces. So these are the spaces which are at the intersection of, let's say, law and activism, or planning and sociology, or gardening and poetry. And I've met a lot of people who are more comfortable in these in-between spaces. And I have also started calling myself an in-betweener now. So if you feel like you don't belong in your profession, hello, that's me as well. And I'm sure there are a lot of in-betweeners in the crowd. So that's where I'm coming from. And in Social Design Collaborative, in our practice as well, we have been working at the intersection of architecture, art, policy, planning, activism. And the project that I wanted to share with you comes from one such space. It's a public art festival, which was organized last year across 6 Indian cities. And because it was organized by the French Embassy, it was the Indo-French festival as part of a larger festival called Bonjour India, which the French Embassy organizes every few years. It also then traveled to France. So let me share my screen and show you a few images and the sort of provocations that the project was trying to raise, the sort of questions it was trying to ask. Oops, I always do this. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, Swati, we can see.
Thank you. Okay, so how often do you see women simply, just loitering at tea stalls? And I use the word loitering deliberately from the book Why Loiter. Maybe outside some schools, offices, you might see a lot more women than is the norm. But typically, it's very hard to find a woman just sitting and sipping a cup of tea in our public spaces across Indian cities. And actually, this is across cities in the world, but let's focus on the Indian context for now. Who does public space belong to at night? A few years back, some of the hostels in Delhi University had a curfew which was different for women, different for men. It was earlier for women around 8 p.m. and later for men. And so what they're trying to say is that the city belongs to men after 8 p.m. Of course, powerful movements have come out of that sort of unfairness, like the Pinjra Tod movement. Where do women exercise in our cities? A recent study has shown that only 3% of women in India exercise. So I know at this point you're also thinking that, okay, if I'm working in my house, if I'm also cleaning and doing a lot of work, that's exercise. But exercise is really the time you take out, you choose to take out for your body, for your physical and mental health. So that's manual work, which is different from exercise. I'm a big fan of open gyms, which have started coming about in so many Indian cities, and because of which I think so many more women are stepping out for exercise. How often do we see women or transgender people simply lying down in a park, just relaxing, just being? And who gets to occupy public space with confidence and power? So no points for guessing, it's cis heterosexual men. And why is that? So the answer to that question is another question: who gets to design our cities? So if you think about cities, especially which have been designed from scratch, like Chandigarh, for instance, Brasilia. Do you know of any city which has been designed by a woman or a group of women? Or if I ask you a simpler question, how many streets in your city, in Bangalore, do you know which have been named after women? Now, I know I'm not there, I can't hear, but if someone is shouting out any answers, maybe Kiran, you can quickly tell me what they're saying.
All right, we're going to ask everyone, is there, but I guess without a mic, you won't be able to hear Janu.
Maybe you can just repeat what one or two people are saying.
I can do that.
I don't think there are a lot of responses to that.
Would anybody like to respond to this?
What are the streets in Bangalore named after women? Or chalks, plaza?
So nothing comes to mind, Swati?
What? Come on, there has to be one. In Delhi, the first thing people think of is Amrita Shergill Marg, Kasturba Gandhi Marg.
Okay, Swati,
Okay. Well then, I guess my question is answered.
Okay.
The
Queen
larger
of England,
question-
Mother Teresa, these are the ones.
Okay. So a very, very tiny, like minuscule sort of percentage. And it's not that women haven't done exemplary work. It's not that women haven't been a part of designing our cities. It's just that a lot of the times they have gone unrecognized, their work has gone unrecognized, uncelebrated, and women are very often hidden figures. So that's also something that we need to talk about. So these are the kind of questions that we wanted to raise and discuss with people on streets, like Kiran was saying, also because architects don't like to talk to people or listen to people. So it has become very important over the years for me to try and do that. And also when we talk about public art, it's not really ever truly public. Very few people also have access to art events. So I can't say that we were, completely successful, but we tried our best to take the Public Art Festival, to the public, cutting across class, caste, religion, economic backgrounds. And this was in 6 cities in Jaipur, Chandigarh, Pune, Bangalore, Delhi, and Ahmedabad. And also then we went to Lyon. In France. And we were asking people a very simple question. In every city, we went to 6 neighborhoods, cutting across economic backgrounds, class, caste, religion, like I just mentioned, to ask people a very simple thing: where do you like to go? What is your favorite public space in the city where you like to go again and again with friends, with family, or by yourself? And also they had to vote on why. Is it because there's a lot of parking? Is it because it's accessible? Is it because there's a lot of greenery? Is it because you can play or your children can play? Is it because it's got a lot of street vendors? And so what started to emerge as people started voting is a sort of a pattern, a certain perspective by different genders in the city, because we had different stickers, different colored bindis, which we put on the forehead for different genders. So women had red, men had black, transgender people had orange, and non-binary people had purple as a color. And I'm not going to show you all the maps. They're all available on our website in the open source section, especially Bangalore, if you want to check out. Of course, people said, Lal Bagh, Cubbon Park, Koramangalam. And these sort of activities, so we would just pin up these maps, on, let's say, on the wall of a public park, or outside a temple or a church or a mosque, or, just like a workshop, like a focus group discussion sort of space on the ground, on the street. And this is what the interactions look like. This is in Chandigarh, and this was at different times of the day, depending on who was available when. So we would have passers-by interacting with the map over a few hours, and very quickly it would get filled. Now this is, I don't know if you can recognize, this is Russell Market in Shivaji Nagar in Bangalore, in front of the church there. This is in Delhi in front of the Cohort studio. And most of these interactions had a lot of men, of course, because it was in public space. And so many times we also had to go out of our way to then seek the women, maybe in the middle of the day, especially we wanted to interact with homemakers and, do special sort of sessions or workshops inviting the women in the neighborhood. This is a photo from Jaipur. And of course, similar sessions with the transgender people as well, because again, there are not a lot of transgender people visible in public spaces, or who are able to occupy public spaces in the same way that men and women are. This is with Aravani Art Project in Bangalore. So in Bangalore, our partners were IIHS, Subhay, and Smita and Ruchika, and so many others from the team, RV College, there was a Aravani Art Project, Design Beku, and of course Alliance Francaise Bangalore. And the whole project has been organized by the French Institute and the Alliance Francaise Network. And so just to also wrap up quickly, because I think I'm heading towards the end of my time. So all of these maps, it was very important for us to bring these conversations together at a very central, open to all public venue in every city. And everywhere we tried to do this in a very sort of accessible space as a form of placemaking. Now this is an underpass in Chandigarh in Sector 17. This is in the old city in Ahmedabad, so one of the poles. This is just on the pavement in Pune. And this is, I think many of you might know, this is the Rangoli Metro Art Center in Bangalore. This is my last slide. So if I can just take a minute, I quickly want to share what people in Bangalore said. Kiran, can I take a minute to do that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So of course, Bangalore is a very progressive city, and it has, the highest number of women in the IT sector when compared to any other city in India. But at the same time, how many women are there in the boardrooms? It's a mere 4% is the sort of statistic that came up. Apart from that, of course, Bangalore is a much safer city when compared to Delhi, where I live. But at the same time, what we realized is that a lot of people were facing challenges because of petty crimes, because of chain snatching. If they're going cycling or let's say running in the morning or in the evenings. And why is that? This is something another architect, Prem Chandawakar, he pointed out. It's because there are no eyes on the street. In the garden city, there are no street, there are not as many street vendors as there should be when compared to, let's say, Ahmedabad, where the street life is really active. So while on one hand, it's a very, I think, well-designed city from the lens of there is a lot of greenery around. Of course, the lakes are dying is another thing. But at the same time, there isn't the sort of active street life that we need for the streets to be safe and vibrant. And a third thing which also came up is the experience of transgender people. What they were saying is that they're not able to travel by buses in Bangalore because the way you have to sit is very binary, right? Either it's like if you're a man, you sit on one side, women sit on the other. So if they sit with women, the women feel scared. They start to shift away because they don't want to sit with them. And if they try to sit with the men, then often they get harassed, they get groped. So to avoid all that stigmatization and harassment, they just prefer to take the metro. The ones that we interacted with through Aravani, this was their experience. But in Delhi, it's just the opposite. The transgender people that we've spoken to here, they do not take the metro. And why is that? Because the frisking, when you enter the metro, is again a binary. It's a different sort of a line for the body scans for men, different line for women. And again, to avoid this daily harassment, when people say, no, you should not be here, you should be here, they just prefer to take the auto, for instance. And so these are the kind of conversations that were very important for us to talk about. Where toilet is a basic right. Can we have a toilet for transgender people? And can these rights extend beyond just a toilet? Can we also talk about livelihoods? Can we talk about identity? Can we talk about representation? And can we talk about it in an accessible way so that your grandmother, my neighbor, they can understand these conversations about non-binary people, transgender people. These might be very new concepts for many people who would like to learn. And for us to create a safe space for these conversations to happen. Anyways, I think I might have overshot my time, but just to give you a glimpse of the processes we have tried, and hoping to return to a bit more in the coming discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Swati. You did pack in a lot. So what we're going to, I'm just going to suggest that it might be nice for each one of us to, with whatever Swati has shared, to just reflect a little bit for now on, what it is that we consider a good public space in our minds. Because I think each of us would probably, consider, look for different characteristics. So what is it in our minds that takes us to one public space and not another? So with that little bit of reflection going on, we'll probably move on to our next speaker.
Okay, so like Asha introduced me, I am an architect and I have my own practice with 4 other partners. So my journey working in the public realm began somewhere around 2017, and I graduated from architecture in 2020. So we began our journey in the public realm while we were still studying itself. So why this is important is because our approach as in our late teens and early 20s to a public space was very came from a response to a problem that we were facing ourselves personally. So when you're in that age group, right, your life becomes very eventful. Suddenly you have a huge group of friends and there's always a need for a social activity. You want to meet somewhere, you want to gather somewhere, it's someone's birthday. And architecture is such a course where you have just one group project after another. I don't know how many architects are in the crowd, but I'm sure any other profession can relate to it. And in our city, there is no public space that facilitates such an activity. Now let's take, for example, our neighborhood parks are designed for joggers and walkers, and there's a kids play area. So you typically find a walking track, and there's the play space, right? So if I have to, let's say, meet up a friend on a weekend, I find myself in a public park which has a huge fence around it. And I walk around the fence to find a small gate somewhere which writes, it opens from morning 6 a.m. till maybe 8 a.m. and then again opens from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. in the night. So again, with the physical barrier and also this barrier of time, they're already defining the kind of age group and the activity that these public spaces can house within them. Now, what do, and you know, at that age when your life is so eventful, your memories with your friends and all of these, it's the time where you start nostalgically connecting with places in your city. So this first slide of mine just talks about what my how I'm experiencing my city. My city, experience of my city and my nostalgia is within a Domino's, in Domino's, in CCD or in a mall. And I will typically find the same spaces anywhere in any other city. So what is that unique thing that connect with? Whereas the same question you ask an older generation, could you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so a memory of Bangalore for somebody who is not a millennial is this. This is Sajjan Rao Circle. You can just see how open and accessible it used to be. And what happened that suddenly in the late 90s, these barricades started to come up around our public spaces. Maybe this is something that we can discuss, open for discussion to the audiences, because I see a good mix of all generations here, so we all might have a perspective on this. So, and also it was during that time where people who've maybe studied a little bit about the history of Bangalore know Sir Mirza Ismail and T.P. Isar, who have who stressed upon having spaces that are pleasurable in the city. Right? So somewhere we have started to lose that sensibility, and the way our city and public spaces have developed have become very utilitarian rather than addressing these simple recreational needs. It could be just a place of gathering or a place of solitude. As an individual living in a city, I would like a place maybe now and then to just reflect upon, sit by myself and maybe study. So that's the kind of perspective we were looking at urban spaces from. And by we, I mean, so while we were in college, I happened to meet friends who are now my partners. They're also in the audience today. So we happened to be a group of people who shared the same passion for, doing something impactful in the public realm, and we started to question these things. So around the same time, you could just scroll through all the slides, please. So these are just some comparisons of how Bangalore was before and the image of Bangalore now with all these fences and fences coming up. Yeah. Actually, could you go back for a minute? Yeah, so in this image, actually, this is also a part where our project is happening now. If you see the old image of Town Hall, there's a big oval in front of it. Now that is a place dedicated for a pedestrian or a gathering, right? Whereas you see over time, the current image, most of our infrastructure planning has been taken away by problems of mobility. But there are these simple, mundane problems, or needs of recreation, and nothing is addressing that. So this is something that we started questioning very early on while we were studying. Yeah, so around the same time, there was a competition opened up by student body of architecture called NASA. The brief of the competition was to identify a redundant and a neglected urban space, and then you give a meaning to it. So something as simple as that, and while working on this project, again, it was a big group project. We were having our own issues of finding places to meet up. And while we identified a neglected space, and while we were discussing what this should become, then that's when we realized all the problems that I've listed out now, a lack of having a nostalgic connect with our city because there are no spaces that facilitate these needs of your youth. And so these problems sort of became the idea, like this is what we want to do with this space. And around the same time, I happened to visit Japan, right? Now, I'm a 90s kid from Bangalore, and my only exposure to a public public space is a parked fence. I mean, fenced park, sorry. So so I haven't experienced like a free flow of public space. And I landed in Japan, and the cities of Tokyo and Osaka, I'm moving from one public place to another public place. Sometimes I'm in a private land, which almost is a very seamless transition and flow of movement, and that really blew my mind away, and started to question, why is this not happening in my city? Well, there's also the aspect of public behavior in Japan is very different from public behavior you'd expect here. But maybe somewhere I started to question, maybe because people haven't experienced these sort of places, is that why there is no public behavior responding to this in our city? So I came back and we had all these discussions. We were all talking about these problems with each other while we were doing this project. And suddenly when we found this piece of neglected land, and we realized, you know what, let's just do this like an experiment. We are going to make this a barrier-free public space. It's a 120-meter long stretch. The location of the park is ideal because the neighborhood is a mixed neighborhood. It has a good combination of students. It has a good combination of all age groups that might use this space, and also offices and institutions. So, and it is at a place of transit. So this is near National College Metro Station. So you walk out of the metro station, and a little away from it, you find this place. So along with so if you can see the difference of the before image and the after image, you know that this was a redundant space which was already fenced, right? Now, fencing happens with a sense of insecurity that our authorities have of people vandalizing it, right? Now, while trying to escape from that kind of a public behavior, fencing it has actually led to more negligence, caused more of these spaces to become redundant. So we presented this idea to BBMP, which takes up these projects. And for our surprise, they were very receptive to the idea. So the thing with BBMP is it is not an environment where they are envisioning such things for the city. They have a set way of working they've been doing, and they are asking for these visions from people. So it was kind of a surprise for us, but they were very receptive. But I also had a certain conversation or concerns that the engineers put across from their experiences. So I'd like to share one incident that I had a conversation. He was an engineer, and he was saying, madam, even with fences, right? We put up fences to avoid, illegal or vandalism happening in public places. But even with 1.2 meter height of fences, we find broken beer bottles, and we find, people are sometimes just misusing these places. So when you open it up, how is it resolving anything? Isn't it more risky and dangerous? So our response to that was something I think Swati pointed out at, was eyes on the street. So this is important. So our response to that was, you open up these spaces, and that's the solution, and you make these spaces well lit, ensure these spaces are very visible. And then he started to say, he didn't seem very convinced, so he was just very hell-bent on proving me, or he was just hesitant or trying to make a point. And he suddenly said, no, I don't think you understand, you're still 20s and you may not get it, but I'm just gonna ask you, women cannot jump fences. So that's when I realized what he's insinuating is, when you have an open place, sometimes these places there are illegal activities like prostitution that they start housing. And this is a real concern. So again, my response to that was, it's a textbook solution to an illegal activity. You open these spaces up, and even after opening them up, making them well lit, if these activities are happening so fearlessly, now, who is responsible for it? The solution is not, creating fences and making spaces that actually are going to house more bad activities in them. But if it is still fearlessly happening, then what is our law enforcement doing? Isn't that the solution to the problem, rather than closing these places up? Well, this is an actual problem we faced in Arlikatte also, which I'll maybe bring it up when I get to the part where This happened about 4 years ago. So I would also like to share with you guys pictures of what the place looks like now, because this was an experiment to see how a neighborhood would respond to a open space like this, an absolute inclusive space where you have all the aspects that I was mentioning initially, a place of solitude, a place of gathering, a place for kids, and everything. So these are pictures of our interactions with BBMP and the corporator and some of the people from the neighborhood. So a corporator is our easy. So we, as designers, there are only some, we were students, so there was only a fraction of the neighborhood that we could interview or get a perspective from. But a corporator is a person who has connection to all of them in the neighborhood, right? So he became our a person who was easily accessible to and the voice of the neighborhood. And yeah, the gentleman's name was Yash, and from how much our experience with him, everybody in the neighborhood really liked him, and we saw him interacting with them every day. And after the opening of the park, he used to come back to us and tell us, this is the problem that's happening, do you want to do something about it? So that was our experience with the corporator. And the image that you see there, so as designers, right, as architects especially, designing the space is the easiest thing to do, and proposing. So what happens after that, we are not taught. So what happens in BBMP after that? You give a proposal, right? So the engineers, they liked the idea, they wanted to persevere on it, so they helped us in letting us know what they want from us to take it to the point where it can be executed. They want a BOQ, they want things in a certain format that can be accountable after the execution, right? So we sat hours on end in their offices asking people, trying to figure out how it's done, and then we somehow figured it out, and the execution of the design that we had proposed started. Yeah, so you can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so these are Google reviews that I took snippets of for the presentation. You can see a lot of them talk about birthday celebrations, and they talk about, I think, area best for couples. They talk about, it's a nice open park with a gym. And all of those are most of them are 3 years ago or 2 years ago. And suddenly everything close to 9 months say that it's very ill-kept or ill-maintained. Now, although our authorities or BBMP is very excited in taking up infrastructure projects, and we have elaborate budgets on them, nobody is accounting for maintenances, right? It's not enough to just have an ambitious infrastructure project. Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to mend it, right? So this was an interesting experience from that point of view. So here, I'd also again like to share in between around. So far I've spoken about my interaction with a corporator or a BBMP. Now I want to talk about public also. So within like the 6 months of the project, right? So we had something called bollard lights. So people who are not from an architecture background, these are small lights. They are very good for an urban space, lighting up a small seating area. They define a particular area inside, outside of a space. So we put up bollard lights because they were looking very pretty in the space. Within 3 to 4 months, we started to see some of the bollard lights were missing. And then we started to see most all bollard lights were missing a cap that it has. And another 6 to 4 months, the light fixtures in the bollard lights were missing. And soon, within 1 or 2 years, none of the bollard lights were in the place. So this is also a type of public that we are talking about or addressing in our public space. So the lesson from this for us is how do we now I spoke about my experience in Japan. So something like this is not going to happen in Japan, right? So we wanted to now look at public spaces to design. Sorry, did I overshoot my time?
I was thinking maybe we move on to Yash and let him share his work. Then we come back and then you can sort of share a few more examples.
Sure. Yeah? I'll just maybe close with one statement. So after this, we were trying to look for a vandal-proof solution. And the lighting company I approached and I asked them, it's a very popular one, I asked them, do you have a vandal-proof bollard light with you? Because we need this. The response was, no, all the fixtures that we have come from Italy. And these are places that work for Italy. So what are we designing as designers for our country is a question that maybe I could stop with. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. So I think, now with Namrata having spoken about, I think there are lots and lots of points to sort of think about here. And one of the points that strikes me, which would, I think, go across everyone's work is, what is the degree of publicness that a public space offers, right? And as you said, that, it also depends on, it sort of affects the behavior. Sometimes the behavior determines, how public a space can be. So it's sort of interdependent. And I guess this comparison with another country, let's say Japan or some part of Europe, what it also tells us is that, as Swati said, the more we engage with people on the ground, the more we ourselves have something to think about, but we're also then making everybody think a little bit more about public spaces. And I think if there is more engagement of this kind from designers, from architects, from, let's say, urban designers, planners with the public, what's going to happen probably, hopefully, is that the public's going to become more and more aware, right? So I think it's then going to allow us that higher degree of publicness, perhaps. So I think, the work all of you are doing is really, really valuable in that sense, that it's going to change the way the public thinks about what they can or cannot do, right, in the city. So I'm going to ask Yash to now share some of his work and his thoughts.
Thank you, Swati and Namrata and Kiran. I'm literally sitting in between some practices that really inspire and something that they own as their, research and as their design process. I'm really inspired. Just a request to move to my slides. No, it's not this. It starts, you'll evidently find me in the first slide. So I'm an artist, studied at Chitrakala Parishad, grew up in Bangalore. And the Bangalore that we grew up in, had open public spaces like Namrata shared. And one that is closest to me is Vidhan Sauda, where our family used to go every Sunday for picnics and sit at the staircase right at the door, and my earliest memory is to skate over there. So coming from that, I never thought, that memory would be so core to my practice. When I studied at Chitrakala Parishad, there was a lot of, how the creative profession is. It puts you into existential angst. You're around a lot of creative talent, so you really get introspective. So it was a time to really figure out who I am in between all of the wonderful creative people around me, and found many medias that became tools for me to express myself through sculpture. And it was also the advent of social media, a very powerful tool that I can say till date I'm not prepared for, because the minute we posted about our work, people we didn't know across the world would interface. And it is something that I find a lot of grounding in, all the chaos of living in a city. There's so much visual and sound and sensory overload that we get. I think it's nice to go back to something that is traditional, caveman-like practice. And in the formative college years, I started exploring the city by walk, because I really wanted to get away from my friends. They're all too talented, all too cool. So the city became really the context of my work, where I would find, solace and also inspiration, like fruit shells in seasons or flowers. Bangalore, by the way it was designed for public, it was so beautiful. And because Chitrakala Parishad is at that very close to the golf course and racecourse road and all of that, all designed wonderfully well with the pavement and all of that, I always found something interesting to the other to bring to class to show to my friends who had no interest. And a lot of time went into exploring what do I really think about the city. So certain practices are shown here. I won't get into the details of each, but we used some playgrounds where in the summer we brought ice blocks through a collective called 080. There were architects, there were other performance artists, there were tradition artists who came to put their work through action to create a dialogue with the public on what they are trying to interpret. Loss of lakes in that playground, because all of our lakes used to be, all of our playgrounds, not all, but most of them used to be lake. That's why they're really submerged. And we're talking through metaphors, through objects, through action. I became a zebra in one of the photos to paint a zebra crossing. I'm like, why are they so gridded and so, in pattern? Why can't I break it? So whims like that, creative. And, it went on for a couple more years till reality hit me after college that I have to get into a profession. We can move to the next slide. So, Shrishti was doing something really interesting. A lot of my friends would mock me because we are all from middle-class families, and they say that your thinking is like Shrishti kids. It's like, what do you mean? They're like, you're so experimental, you're so focused about the meaning of one thing that you don't focus on creating more. And I'm like, yeah, I'd rather find meaning. And Shrishti was doing this project called Art in Transit. It is a lab that is situated at some selected metro stations that they have adopted or have got into a collaboration with the Bangalore Metro, because at the time of the launch of the Bangalore Metro, there was a lot of criticism coming through to the metro saying you're cutting the greens, you're cutting through, urban poor localities, and you're bypassing localities that are very strong in its community sense to resist the line of the metro. So the metro found itself in a lot of tension, and there were 2 or 3 practitioners at the time, Arzu Mistry, Amitabh Kumar, and Abhyan, who approached through the director of Shrishti, founder director, Dr. Geeta Narayanan, to the Bangalore Metro asking for permission to work in one of the metro stations because the metro was just about to launch its services. And the metro said, listen, don't propose painting projects, come back with, understand what your institution is. It's a design and art and research-led institution. We also work with technology, so please give us a bigger pitch. And I think the director, who is really, the boldest creative that I've seen in my life, who took on the task of setting up Art in Transit project where it became a classroom at Pina in 2014 or 15. That's where the same time I was graduating, I would have students from Shrishti come closely watch how sculpture practices were working. That's how I interfaced with their students at the time. And when I got to learn that they're getting to use real world situations and places as classroom, I was very excited. And really longed to be part of it. But CKP, I was notorious in my practice to be a rebel, to work always outside the studio, always work outside, the context that the teacher provides. And one day, my principal then, Dr. Kulkarni said, if you really think you're so creative, go outside and work. And I took that as a challenge. That's how I came across the Art in Transit project when they had moved to the Cubbon Park station after 2 years of practice at the Pina station, where students and faculty led courses through the year to be site-specific and place-led. Now, a lot of the research happens for design, happened for design at that phase where at the context of understanding of Pina. They're very hyper-local based. Industrial city, old factories, heritage space of sorts, and kept outside the main city. So there's a lot of context for the students to go and research and come back to and try to implement it through some creative act, through a sculpture, through installations, in a way to share stories of sight in materiality and in context. And every student was encouraged to have a research inquiry of their own. So that's how Art in Transit really facilitated its projects where the lab collected all the inquiries and that became the research. When we moved to Cubbon Park Station, And what really happened is that the premise that was given to Art in Transit is that you're in the center of the city now. You have been brought in through the tourism department because the government really liked your work at Pina. You have the responsibility of programming for the public. That came with a lot of pressure for Art in Transit leads who took it on to program some of the largest public events that happened in 2016 and 17, where my journey started as a volunteer. I was just catching Pokemon after my graduation. I had nothing else to do to break from, all heaviness of life. And then someone identified me in the park, alone catching Pokemon, and an hour later with 200 people with me, because I created a WhatsApp group. I was able to move people left, right, center, go to different areas of the park, run. And the the faculty, Arzu and Amita, really were curious, like, who is this guy who's able to mobilize, the other wanderers in the park so well? Because they were doing public programs, or at least they were starting, some inquiries came. Hey, what are you doing in life professionally? I said, not much, freelance, painting here, there, painting underpass. And then they give me the big picture, saying that we're doing a large public art program that involves activists, researchers, pedagogues, students, institutions. So we're happy to come and give a presentation at CKP. I said, why not? Let me make the connection. And when this happened two-way, when I got to see, as a volunteer, what they were doing on ground, because I was very nervous. This is a design and research and, very focused kind of institution where CKP is very traditional. And being an observer became my role for the next few years. We can move to the next slide. So a lot of inquiries came through. And then over the years, what happened is that we did series of events that were open to public to participate, and they happened on site. We announced the projects on the internet through social media. But what really grew is the sense of community for us. The people who'd come for the first event would come back to want to host an event on their own. And it was our responsibility to make sure public had access to getting permissions. And we wanted that to become a model where the public becomes the programmer. And students interfacing, spending their 8th semester, which is the final semester projects, in the station researching from the place, context of Shivaji Nagar, of the heritage that is around the station, the HL office, the GPO, the income tax building. We were suddenly around so much context that we had an overflow of trying to understand which Bangalore were we really tackling, because in Pina, we understood it's an industrial Bangalore. In Cubbon Park, it's the garden city vision. So which Bangalore do we talk about in which metro station became the context? And a lot of our inquiries were left sometimes on walls painted. And over the years, our practice kept evolving, where, like I said earlier, it was research for design at Pina, and at Cubbon Park Station, because we're really at the forefront of public events under the government of Karnataka and the BMRCL, we were designing through research. We were figuring things out and connections and making our ties with public stronger and stronger with each event module that we conducted every few months. And of course, the community grew. The team of artists, designers, researchers, activists who came on board only became larger. You can move to the next slide. And over the years, from working with Biome, working with the Bangalore Design Week, working with researchers such as Alia Rizvi, we were able to create different modules of practice that Art in Transit never owned, but incubated for other creatives. And a lot of students also incubated their formative design practices that they would sometimes go on to extend into their professional career. So Art in Transit really provided the, the confidence and the push that their curiosity needed for their confidence to grow. And what better place in a controlled environment? Like Namrata shared earlier, and Swati, that public spaces are not really friendly to work in. They're not really conducive to a pedagogic design curriculum. But metro stations where it's very controlled environment, you had housekeeping staff, you had security. I think the students through the years, many practices at Shrishti, like I spoke about the 8th semester project, we had the interim project that Meenawari hosts, which is getting designers and artists from across the world to mentor students and the public on creative practices. And they were hosted across 5 to 6 different metro stations at one point. So we moved on from being at one site. Our conference really grew as the body that hosted the project to create a model of the public practices of the future. What does it take to run a project at the metro station? We created frameworks, we created toolkits, and then we became part of a larger creative assembly called the Metro Neighborhood Initiative, where Art and Transit was just one of the partners, but other creative partners that worked on sustainability, on culture, on language became part of it. You can move to the next slide, yeah. Yeah. Similarly, different research agendas came through. You can move on. We really explored the tensions of inside and the outside. We really explored through guided walks, through experimental sound performances with ISRO, Kavya Sanjay through literature, critical literature. Sometimes even did events for the staff of the metro solely because we realized that the happiest audience that we ever had and who'd push us to do more events. You can move to the next slide. I think public forums like Google reviews are always honest ways of people sharing their thoughts. A lot of times positive remarks to the atmosphere, and all these works are just residues. What we have at the stations, they are leftovers from what the research process is of a student or a practitioner. Sometimes we really learn, our design processes learn from how we were not successful, and they come through, sometimes we are aware that it can become a very exclusive design or creative practice that only we are in a meta conversation understanding, but we are able to adapt. The vigilance of the metro, the government, the public is very tight on the metro because I guess it's one service that everyone has high expectations of. So it's the easiest one to take notice and to act. If we can move to the next slide. I would really like to appreciate, sometimes we are not on the ground, we are taking a break, and the staff of the metro really owned the stations after we've left. Like at the Coven Park station, they started recycling from all the housekeeping material, from cleaning, creating planters and boxes, and I think started drawing on their own. I think these are things that we cannot claim, but an atmosphere of memory, of celebration that they have made their own, that we like to see tokens of validation, that, this carries on. Getting postcards just yesterday. So these acts of kindness. Just recently, we hosted the Bangalore Design Week, where the programming was open to the public through a forum, and people could program their own event at the metro station. So that's how we progressed from, a pedagogic-based institution to community-based. And just the last slide, Kiran. Want to close. Where I'm outside of the institution is with my friends. As there's no censorship, and we like to really celebrate each of our practices and really push each other. And I think the Gijikalu Collective made a mark finally after 5-6 years of after painting horrendous public places to now painting in Malleshwaram. So that's how my practice has moved on. Thank you.
Thanks, Yash. So as you can see, we have 3 young people here, extremely passionate about what they do, and of course the team that has come with Namrata. So I guess this is the middle that we were talking about, and we'd love to hear from all of you. In case you have a question, or a set of questions for either one of the panelists or a question around public space that you think it would be good to raise here, please. Yeah.
So I don't need the mic.
No, I think.
Okay.
Yes,
Cool.
you should keep your mic.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm Kim Suka. I have a question about Sankey Tank specifically. It exists and it's closed. It's open from 5 a.m. to about 10 a.m. and then again in the evening from 4 to 10 p.m. But again, you see, like you say, there's lots of fences around. There's lots of security. And there's mostly people in their 50s and 60s who go for walks, and that's what it's used for. But it would be a nice space for people to be able to go read a book or, just do other things. How do we encourage residents to use the space, and people across different sections of society, different age groups? How do you encourage them to go and use the space and feel comfortable to go in there and use it?
Yeah, so would one of you like to answer the
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. So the thing with projects like lake redevelopments, or one project that we are currently involved is with K100. It's a Raja Kalaway that is being revamped and redesigned and turning it into a place for people to use like a recreation. So the thing with these projects is there is a factor of being ecologically sensitive. There's a factor of safety. Like for example, in K100, there's a time where the entire establishment closes at the time during monsoons when the water fills up in the Raja Kalaway. It stops functioning like a waterway. It's supposed to be a pedestrian waterway all the way till Belandur, right? So sometimes in inclusivity or making a space barrier free, there has to be a little bit of a compromise. So for example, in K100, we designed a 300-meter plaza. Now that plaza, they told us, is going to close for 60 to 90 days, and it is going to have a lot of regulations because there's a safety factor involved in it. But what we did was, there is an outside and an inside to that space, right? The outside is the footpath and the inside is your lake or your park. So we extended the outside into the place, right? If it's there, I do have pictures in my slide. Maybe if it's okay, they could put it up. So that's where you start to compromise on how much of that space you can make barrier free, and you need to have some regulations for safety to be ecologically sensitive. Now, for example, Lalbagh doesn't allow photography now, and I had a friend from who flew all the way from Mumbai here just to shoot. He's a photographer, and he wanted to shoot in a natural setting, and he wanted to go to Lalbagh, and he was very disappointed. So there is some place where you kind of compromise on a few things. It may be less inclusive, but maybe it's for the good. You're just making negotiations and prioritizing what is more important in that context. So maybe the lake can be kind of semi-open. Maybe the fence can move back a little bit and be open all times, and they could always change the timings, regulate the timings of when it opens. So that's probably a way to do it.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a little bit here. I think there are two things that you seem to have brought up. One is, of course, that there is a physical barrier and there are timings. But you also said that how do we bring people in? And I think from examples in other cities, for example, what comes to my mind is this place called Shilpa Ramam in Hyderabad. I remember, this was sort of way back since I come from another generation. It comes from somewhere around 2002, 2004. I remember the director of tourism at that time was himself involved with Shilpa Ramam, and he was trying to. So the place had been built. It had, been designed by Shankar Narayanan, who was a reputed architect in Hyderabad, and they were finding it difficult to get people to come in there. It had been designed very beautifully, but there wasn't enough traction. And what Mr. Kishan Rao, who was the director of tourism, decided to do was he started to schedule a series of events back to back. And they did such extensive programming for Shilpa Ramam. So I think sometimes that pull factor comes from just doing a few activities. So initially one would have to program it, like you would have to have, you know, either the local municipality or an RWA who organizes a few events. Another example is Putunahalli Lake, close to, I mean, it's in JP Nagar, and there again, you know, there are, sometimes they do a set of activities which they invite their own residents, local residents for, but then it does attract attention and it does become that pull factor. So if one, I think, has to get people from across generations, from different age groups, then one has to give that start. And perhaps then people will start to come a little bit more. Also, the other thought that came from your question, but also from what the panelists said earlier, there is a very interesting paper called What is Public About Public Space? It's written by these two scholars, Arifi and Meyer, and they talk about, so they do a case study of Visakhapatnam, where they talk about, you know, how they gave out, as Swati had said earlier, that they did a survey, right? They asked people, you know, what was attractive to them as a public space. So here, the scholars, what they did was they had the Vuda Park, which is the Visakhapatnam Urban Development Authority Park, and they had Beach Road as one of the, so they had a list of public spaces and they asked people what they consider public. And a very large majority said Beach Road. And I think for coastal towns, you know, so we have seen this in Bombay, we have seen this in Chennai. For most coastal cities and towns, I think a place like Beach Road can become that example of an accessible, open to all kind of space. So I think if we start to also observe these areas, you know, these beach road areas in these cities, there is something to learn from them. And again, they also organize activities. So, but there it becomes easier. So groups of elderly people organize something by themselves. You don't have to tell them. You don't have to wait for somebody else to do it, right? Would somebody from the audience like to ask a question here?
I just wanted to add one point. Specifically, like in Cubbon Park, the most powerful stakeholder is the Walkers Association. Sankey Tank, you might also have a similar group or a couple of them, especially from Malleshwaram and Sadashiv Nagar, the neighboring areas. Ask them and get them to program. And I think the best kind of activism is the one that is programmed through creative utilization of events. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you, panelists, for giving us an insight onto your work. So my question is, as citizens, right, how do you identify what is a public space to begin with? Like Swati earlier mentioned public toilets. Namrata, you've mentioned about Ali Kates, beyond parks, and you've mentioned about Cubbon Park, which is a transition space, right? And how do you really identify it, own it, for people to begin to respect it, right? And because all these spaces are always like in transition, you don't get that pause to really like recognize them as a static public space. And I think inclusivity of public space begins when people are able to identify it. And with our cities changing and so many, you know, typologies coming in, the new typologies for public space. So what do you have for our citizens to really begin thinking towards that?
Yeah, would one of you like to answer? Swati, do you want to try and answer that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a very good question. I think that is Subhair, if I recognize the voice. Okay. So I think inclusion and public space are very intimately, interlinked. So what is a public space? Is a mall a public space? Well, it is open to public, but not all public right. It excludes a lot of people based on class. There's a security guard who's standing at the entrance and does not let everyone in. In many cases, transgender people have also been barred from entering malls. For example, this happened in Pune. So is that a truly, is that a real public space? Another sort of thing that comes to mind when we're talking about the publicness of public space is, these informal modes of public transport. So I think public transport is also an important form of public space. And e-rickshaws, for instance, in Delhi, it's a very tight, cramped public space, which is of course mobile. So I think these are all layers of public space where inclusion sort of makes them, less public, is the way I look at it. I think I also liked what Namrata said about different degrees of inclusion. And I think this is what we see in our public spaces everywhere. And maybe that's also how we work with it, because our public spaces are made up of these, layers of inclusion. And if we really want to try and change that to make them more inclusive, then we also have to kind of work with it one step at a time. I actually wanted to share something from Visakhapatnam after listening to Kiran. But maybe I can come back to that later, because I find the conversation on barriers, fences, so integral to the idea of public space. I think it's very important to talk about it. And I've been really enjoying all the conversations so far, Namrata and Yash, especially when you talk about, validation from people who are drawing on planters, which they have sort of reappropriated from some materials, and Google reviews. I totally loved, that sort of validation from people, Namrata. Anyways, I think a few thoughts out there, and if we have time to share that anecdote from Visakhapatnam, I'd like to do that later, Kiran.
Okay, sure. Yash, Namrata, do you want to respond to this as well? Anything, if anybody else wants to add something here?
I have a question here actually. Back. Here. So this is like when I saw the slide with gender and public spaces, something came to my mind. I had completed my graduation and post-graduation from Kerala. I was in hostel for most of the time. So something which came to my mind is that the boys' hostel and girls' hostels time restrictions and all that. So this is very, very popular in Kerala. Like the college which I studied, even when I was doing my post-graduation, girls should be at the hostel by 6 o'clock, but boys doesn't have any limitations. And regarding the library would close at 6. And when we were requesting to them, like not me, when the students union and all that, there were this students politics was very, is still very strong there. And when they requested to increase the library timings, they were like, no, we can't do that because girls would come and they will make issues. So why is that happening? And we were so many times this was questioned to the authority and all that, but there were students supporting the timing thing. So I don't know if it's related to some traditions or religion or anything. So is there something that we can do to change these mindsets of people?
I'm going to open this up to the panelists, but before I do that, I think there is, of course, the cultural side to things, which we can't sort of wish away. But Namrata, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I want to respond to that because, I graduated in 2020, not long ago when I was a student. But as a student, contrary to maybe your experience, my experience was opposite. So I'm in an environment which is very equalizing, right? I didn't realize that there was a difference in men and women until I started practicing, to be very honest, right? I knew a lot of some of my professors who were women, and my mother is an architect too. She kept telling me that, and Smita ma'am, she was my professor, she's in the audience today. So there's so many women who kept telling there is difference, you don't realize it, but there is difference. And it was when I started practicing, I realized one of the factors for that difference is safety. Now, for example, a lot of these public projects happen in, let's say, in the night because it's in the middle of the traffic or something like that. And on the day, let's say, there is some, it requires my supervision. As a female architect, if my supervision is required on site, I cannot do that because most of the labors there are men. Most of the contractor is a man because it's physical labor. Most of them have to be men. So it's enough for somebody to look at me a certain way to feel unsafe. So it's not ideal for me to be in a situation like that. But I can always work around it. So I'm very lucky to have four men as my partners. So in all confidence, I had them with me to experience these things. And because of these problems, right, the common notion in the practice is, and also I know my peers who are working in different firms, offices refrain from sending their women associates on site alone or to places, and this actually results in a lack of experiential knowledge. So when I'm interacting with, let's say, a vendor, the way he converses with me is very different from how he would converse with my male associate. So his notion is that I won't know experience, I won't have any experiential knowledge, I can like BS and whatever. So the thing is, a lot of these problems are new because most people in the profession are men, right? And all the rules, or especially if you're doing business, the ways of interacting people, the self-help books you get are from a male perspective. And what I'm very glad that I kind of was exposed to situations and I learned this very early on. We cannot navigate amongst men like men. I cannot respond to these situations like how my male associate would. So there are like a lot of layers and subtle problems, subtle things like these which create these differences. But I can say that situation is much better for me than it has been for my mother, right, when she was an architect. So I think for now that is my response to your question. I don't know, maybe after a couple more years it'll be a different response. So
thanks for that, Namrata, and we're going to look to Yash to solve our problem now. You have to come up with a quick solution because the women here are saying that public spaces are not safe enough, and there is the cultural part. So how does one solve this? Any suggestions for us?
One hack that I use for myself to motivate myself for doing something that seems impossible is to think that someone's making a documentary about me breaking through. And that's it. Just, what would you do? That happened in the lockdown, and it was great that all men were locked in. Yeah.
Okay, but I have to say this, I have actually met more men who have been very supportive and, helped me in a lot of situations than I have met men who have made me feel unsafe. So all my partners are men, so I don't think I would be able to do this without them.
Can I also add to this, Kiran?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think very quickly to respond to the question, I also want to respond to what Yash and Namrata said. So the female body has been regulated for the longest time. This has happened, across the world, across cultures, and also, since men have been holding positions of power. And I mean, another thing actually is also very interesting to think about is how when it comes to city planning, actually the male body is always seen as an ideal for that, whereas the female body somehow is always regulated, especially in public space. Of course, it's also linked to, social relations. So what's happening within the house is also what's happening in the public space, what's also happening, in the library. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about inequality in public space, I mean, at the end of the day, it's basically it's originating from within our family. So I hope that somehow answers your question in one way. Yeah. I wanted to also respond to what Namrata and Yash were saying about, cis het men, because, they seem to be the villain of our stories, right? Like every time I talk about what I talk about, many of them also approach me, with a lot of like good intentions, and they're like, okay, what can we do? What can we do to make things better out of a lot of earnestness? And I think, asking that question is the very first very important step. And I would say, listen, please. Pass the mic, let others speak. And also, thirdly, be open to understanding vulnerability. I think the problem really is that unless you haven't really gone through that, you haven't felt vulnerable, then you don't really realize what it means to be facing that vulnerability. So I've come across a lot of Indian men who have gone abroad, to white countries and faced racism, and actually then started understanding what it means to be an Indian woman or what it means to be a trans woman in India. And I think once we are exposed to that vulnerability, what can we start extending that empathy beyond our immediate, circle of friends and family? And I think maybe that will make things better. That will change things for the better. Yeah.
Thanks, Swati. Thanks for that. We are going to bring this discussion to a close since we are, almost at 8. But as we do that, I think bringing this to a close by the audience telling us very quickly, a few of you, if you could just tell us what is your favorite public space in Bangalore? Just so that we get an idea, what is the kind of public space that you feel safe in, you feel that, in public spaces, you need to feel safe, I guess. You need to feel that you have a sense of calm, you have a sense of belonging. We're giving you hints. And you have a clean environment. You don't have a polluted environment. So are these, the parameters that you look for, or is it none of the above? Is it something else that you look for? So if everybody could just quickly tell us names of places that they absolutely love going to, either to interact or for solitude. Yeah, would you like to use the mic?
Public space, but I think you mentioned many things about it. It's very safe, it's very clean, but it is losing its calm. And I feel very sad about that because it is just becoming a concrete mess, the whole place. And unfortunately, the public doesn't seem to have any say in actually talking to whoever is doing this, the BBMP, I guess, and trying to improve that situation. So it's going from a very nice, green, lovely place where one could see birds and walk. It has been destroyed systematically over the years. And that is a sad thing.
Yeah, I think you're raising an extremely important point here, that it's not about us, creating public spaces in the right way, but it's also about us figuring out how do we sustain the places that we already have. So I think that's an extremely, extremely important point that you're bringing up. Would somebody else like to share what is their, anybody this side? Yeah? You have the mic with you?
Typically do not want to talk about the question that you have raised, but I have a question that I feel is valid for the panel to address. So,
do we have time for panel to? Okay.
Okay, thank you. So when we talk about how inclusive are our public spaces, we have looked at barriers, physical barriers, we have looked at gender. How do we address the point of profession or like marginalized communities like sex workers? How inclusive are public spaces for them where their profession entirely depends on a public space? So how inclusive are public spaces at such scenarios?
From what I remember, I think there's somebody here who has co-authored a book on this, Neeti Menon.
Actually attended that event also, and I have actually tapped upon it in my, so even I'm an architect, so I tapped on it for my thesis, but I still feel there's a lot of thought process and things that has to be tapped on. So I just wanted what the panel has to say.
Sure. I can answer that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, because I was thinking about this, Namrata.
Swati, a short, brief answer.
Okay, I'll try. I was thinking about it when Namrata was talking about her experience in BBMP and what that official had said about, oh, but otherwise there would be sex work. And actually, sex work is also work, and there also there need to be spaces for that. But of course, it needs to be regulated. Is an important part of that work as well. Actually, what we heard about Cubbon Park from a lot of transgender people that we spoke to is that the gentrification of Cubbon Park has put them out of business because after it has been cleaned up and beautified over the last few years, and there's a lot more police patrolling, they are unable to work there in Cubbon Park, and that has really affected their livelihoods. At the same time, what has happened is they used to face a lot of violence in the past, during the sex work because it was not well lit. There were lots of dark spots, and so things could just go awry, at times. And so I think there is no clear answer, but at the end of the day, allowing for activities, but at the same time also making safe spaces with an understanding that safe is not just safe for some people, right? And that inclusion also extends, that generosity also extends to activities like sex work. I think that is an important conversation to have as well. I know it's not a very palatable conversation to have, but it's a very important conversation to have.
Yeah, that's true. So, Swati, thanks for that. And we would like to end this with the last word coming from the audience. So, anybody wants to just say which is their, I'm coming back to that. Yeah?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that we all love to walk on streets. Streets are our best public spaces, and just being here in Sadashiv Nagar and encountering some recent developments and causes of concern kind of highlights the same concerns in all neighborhoods across any city, I think, in India. So I think Indians love hanging out on the streets, by the side of the streets, whether it is a market stretch or like a row of trees. So I think the most inclusive space that we have going for us in India are the streets, really. So I'll stop with streets.
Thank you so much for that. I think we've sort of come around a full circle with this, because we did start off by saying street is the predominant public space. And so thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Yash, Namrata, Swati for doing all the work that you're doing on the ground, and then for bringing it here to share it with everyone. Thank you.